Okay, good morning everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Let's get started. My name is Guy Barker, and I'm a developer in the Windows Human Interaction Platform team. And I've worked on a number of accessibility-related features in Windows, including the on-screen keyboard, the magnifier and narrator features, and also the UI automation API. What I'm going to be talking with you about today is how to reach more customers by building accessible Metro-style applications in HTML5. So what I'm going to do to start with is an overview of three very important points. The first is why this matters to you as a developer, that you build accessible apps. Then I'm going to talk about the industry standard technologies that you'll use as part of making your app accessible. And finally, how we've built in support for developing apps into the development platform right from start to finish, from creating a new app to ultimately selling it at the Windows Store. And then after that, I'll be running through some demos of the various stages of building your app, from creating it, developing it, verifying its accessibility, and then selling it at the store. And as soon as this is done, I'll be heading over to the expo hall, into the apps booth. So if we hold off on questions during the session, I'll follow up with you afterwards in the expo hall, and we'll have a chance to talk more about this. Okay, so why does this matter to you? Why is it important that you build an accessible app? A few years ago, Microsoft commissioned some research to determine how likely is it that computer users are going to benefit from accessible technology. And accessible technology includes the accessible features of software. And what this research found was that 17% of working-age computer users in the US are very likely to benefit from accessible technology. So that would include users who are blind and would use a screen reader to have what's shown visually on the screen read out to them. And also it would include users with severe mobility impairments who might use an on-screen keyboard because it's not practical to use a physical keyboard. Now, in addition to the 17%, another 40% of users were also found to be likely to benefit from accessible technology. And this includes users with mild disabilities or impairments, but also a great number of users who don't consider themselves to have a disability at all, but simply find it easier to use software by leveraging some of the accessible features of software. And a classic example of that is users who want to have the text shown on the screen bigger. If the text on the screen is bigger, it's easier to read and it can be more productive. And some of you in the room might already have your computer settings set such that the text on the screen is bigger. Or I'm sure some of you in the room have also helped family members adjust their settings to make text on the screen bigger and so easier to read. And so what this research determined, that the majority of users are either likely or very likely to benefit from accessible technology. And at the time this research was done, that was around 74 million people. And certainly the interaction model with computers has evolved since this research was done. The fundamental importance of building accessible software hasn't changed. So, you're building a Metro-style app in HTML5. You're going to build a great app, and a great app is accessible. How you make your app accessible is by using the same industry-standard technologies that you use if you're going to make content on the web accessible. So if you actually already know how to make content on the web accessible, you already know how to make your your Metro-style app in HTML5 accessible. And how this is done is using HTML5, the accessible features of HTML5, along with the ARIA markup. That's the Accessible Rich Internet Application specification. And these are industry standard. There's a ton of information about these technologies on the web, the W3C sites and others, that give you a lot of details and also guidance onto best practice of these technologies. And one of the great things about ARIA is it has the concept of roles. You're going to build UI that looks great, but it's very important to a user of an assistive technology such as a screen reader to also have some meaning associated with this UI. And a classic thing is something that looks like a table. If you have numbers and rows, columns, it should be a table, not just displayed in that sort of layout. So roles can really help an assistive technology client app expose that information in the way that's most useful to their clients. Another very important aspect of ARIA is the concept of properties. And properties allow you to apply fine detail to the markup you'll use in your UI to make the UI more accessible in a way that it can't be as accessible without the use of the ARIA properties. And a great thing about using the ARIA roles and properties in your markup is that all this information is easily accessible to any assistive technology client that uses the UI automation API. And UI automation is a way for a client app to gather up information about what's shown on the screen and to present it in the way that's most useful to their clients. And as well as gathering up that information, the client app can also programmatically interact with it. And UI automation is built into the system, and it takes care of all the work to channel the information about what's shown visually in your app over to the client application. So what I thought to do next is show a screenshot of one of the Windows 8 SDK sample apps called ARIA Sample, and we'll take a closer look at this later. And the reason why I'm showing this, I thought it would help just to run through some of the more fundamental aspects of accessibility. This is only a handful of the things that you would consider when you're building an accessible app. These are some of the important things. Towards the top left of the screen is a button. It's a back button, but there's no text on the screen to say back. So when a screen reader presents that information about that button to a user, it must be able to get the word back somewhere. And similarly, it's a disabled button. So the state, whether it's enabled or disabled, would need to be presented to the screen reader user. To the right of that button is some text. It says ARIA Sample. The text is presented in white letters there. And if the user was a high contrast user, a high contrast theme user, then that text color, just like the color of all the text in the UI, would need to change to be presented in the foreground color that the user wants in that high contrast theme. In the middle of the app, I've just highlighted one particular piece of UI, a blue square, and just to remind us that if the user's selected an option to make everything on the screen bigger, then this element, just like everything on the screen, would want to get bigger and still look great. And while we're actually talking about that particular piece of UI, I just remind everyone that it's really important not to present information through the use of color alone. A lot of your customers will be colorblind. So if you have, say, 3 squares, a red, a yellow, or a green one in your UI, there has to be some other way to present information about the meaning of that UI, whether it's text labels nearby or tooltips. Now, towards the top right of the screen is another area, and this application is a simulated chat app. And this area would be the chat history window, where the content of that UI can dynamically change. It can be dynamically updated without direct interaction by the user working at that piece of UI. Now, the user could be working somewhere else. If a screen reader user isn't notified of an update to that piece of UI, that could be very important to the user, that they're not made aware of something. So there has to be some way for the user to be made aware of that. And ARIA can help here because you can mark parts of your UI as live regions, meaning if there's some update dynamically made to that region, a screen reader should notify the user about that. And the last part I'll highlight on this screenshot is towards the bottom right. There's an input field where the user would type whatever it is they want to say in their chat conversation. And it's important that the user can use the tab key to set keyboard focus to that field before they start typing. Any piece of UI that the user can interact with will need to be accessible through the keyboard. Keyboard accessibility is fundamental to a number of accessibility scenarios. Now, while those things I've just said are some fundamental sorts of things about accessibility, you as an app developer can decide to take this further with accessibility depending on the features of your app. If, say, you present audio, you might have a captioning window to present that information to a deaf user. Similarly, if you are building a reader app, you might have a drop-down with different text sizes to make the text easier to read without changing the size of the rest of the UI. Okay, so we've talked about how there's a huge number of potential customers interested in accessible apps. It's industry standard technologies you're going to use to make your app accessible. And this third point is how we've built support for developing apps into the platform, from creating a new app from one of the templates. The template's accessible by default, so your new app you've created is accessible. When it comes to developing your app, to turn it into your app, you're going to add controls from the set of controls that comes with the Windows 8 SDK. Those controls are accessible, so when you add them to your app, they're accessible by default. When it comes to verifying your app, you're feeling pretty good at this stage that your app's accessible, but you really want to understand whether there are any gaps in its accessibility story. There are a couple of great tools in the Windows 8 SDK, which I'll be demoing later, to help you feel confident about the accessibility. And finally, when it comes to selling your app at the Windows Store, there's a way for you to really draw attention to the fact that your app is accessible and make it really easy for people to discover your app. Okay, so now I'm going to start running through some demos of these 4 stages of creating an app, developing it, verifying it, and selling it. So what I'm going to do is create a new app in Visual Studio Express, and there are a number of accessibility-related scenarios that you'll be interested in, but I'm going to be focusing on 3 today. And those are the screen reader use with your app, and in this case I'll be using the narrator feature that comes with Windows 8. You'll need to check that your app is fully keyboard accessible, and also I'll be running the app in high contrast with a high contrast theme to see what happens by default when I switch to high contrast. Okay. Right, so I'm in Visual Studio. What I'm going to do is create a new project. And I'm going to create a new project, a Metro-style app with JavaScript. I'm going to base it on the split application template. And what I'm going to do now is run the Windows 8 narrator feature. We've done a lot of work in Windows 8 to make narrator more fully featured. And how I'm going to launch it is using a new keyboard shortcut in Windows 8, which is the Windows and Enter key.
Narrator window. Focus on
And that launches narrator. And also in Windows 8, you can configure the hardware buttons to also launch narrator or some other assistive technology app you're interested in, whether it's Magnifier or some other assistive technology product. And that's done by pressing the Windows key and the volume up key on the hardware. And actually, before we run this app, I'll close narrator down. Let me do a quick search for the term ARIA in this new app that I've created. And the reason why I thought I'd do this is just to show that there are a lot of hits on the term ARIA in this new app that I've created. So ARIA is being leveraged by a lot of controls in the Windows 8 SDK, and that was brought into my new app when I created it from the template. So there's a lot of support with ARIA, of accessibility with ARIA, already in this new app that I've created. Okay, and I'll increase the text size here. Right, so first thing I'll do is run the app. And this is the new app, completely unchanged from the one that's created from the template. And I'll run narrator again.
Narrator window.
Switch back to the app.
F1.
Okay.
Button.
Now, there's a blue highlight around the back button at the moment. That is presented by narrator, and in this case, it's highlighting where the keyboard focus is. So I'm going to tab away from this button.
0.0 SE, 0.1 SED, 0.2 SED.
So I can use the keyboard to move keyboard focus around the app. I tabbed between different areas of the app and then used the arrow keys to move through the list items. And I'll tab back to the back button.
Back button.
Okay, so narrator said back button, even though there's no text on the screen to say it's the back button, but somehow that text was accessible to narrator. So this new app that I've created is both keyboard accessible and provides the text necessary for a screen reader to present something useful to the screen reader user. So I'm going to close narrator down now.
Exit narrator.
And close the app down. What I want to do next is add a control to this UI. So what I'm going to do is add one of the controls that comes with the Windows 8 SDK, and I'll add it partway down the app. And I'm going to add a rating control. Data win control, and it's win.js.ui.rating. And I'm going to give it some initial value. So I'll say data win options, and we'll give it an average rating value of 3. Okay, so I've just added a new control. So I'll run the app again, and we'll see what that looks like. Okay, at the top of the screen there, it's a little bit clipped at the top, is a rating control with 3 stars showing in it. So now I'm going to turn on Narrator.
Narrator, WinWeb App 1, back 0.
Okay, and now I'm going to tab to that new control that I've added.
Tentative rating,
Oops.
Start menu, running programs.
Sorry, I hit the Windows key there.
WinWeb App 1, WinWeb 0.
I'll try that again.
Tentative rating.
Okay, tentative rating. So basically, when Narrator realized Focus had gone to this control, it said tentative rating. That's the accessible name of that control I added. But I didn't add the text tentative rating anywhere to the app. I just inserted the control, and its accessible name came along for free. I didn't have to do that. So now I'm going to actually use the keyboard to change the value of that rating control.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, 4, sounds good. I'll accept that.
4.
Okay, and now I'm going to tab away from the control and then tab back to it again.
Tentative rating, slider at 4.
Okay, so tentative rating, and it has a value of 4. So that's important information for the screen reader user to access. And all that was presented without me having to do anything specific with accessibility. I just added the control. So the accessibility of that control just came for free. So now I'm going to close Narrator again.
Exit narrator.
And I'll close the app down. Now what I want to do is actually demonstrate some use of the ARIA markup explicitly. So what I'm going to do next is add an input control. I'll go to the toolbox and drag an input control in. There we go. Okay, so that will result in an input field that I can type appearing in my UI. But I want some label associated with that control. So what I'm going to do is add a label before the control in the UI. Now, what I could do with HTML5 is simply say, this is going to be a label for, and then specify the input field that I just added. But I want to explicitly use some ARIA here. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to say I want the accessible name of this control to actually be picked up from 2 different other labels, because that might be more useful for my customer. So I'm going to add a label here, and I'll give it an ID of label timeout, say, because I'm going to build a timeout control of area. And we'll say the text visible on the screen should be timeout. Now I'm going to add another label after the control. We'll say this is units, label units, and we'll say that the input field relates to a timeout of seconds. So I've added two labels there. Now I want to go back to the input field and say the accessible name for this input field should be built up from the text available from these 2 nearby labels. So I'm going to go back to the input field. I'll say aria. Okay, and I've just hit the Control and Space key and brought up the list of things that Visual Studio thinks I can put there. And the one I'm interested in is label by, because I'm saying this input field is going to be labeled by the text available from some other piece of UI. So I'll say label by, and now I just specify the 2 labels that I'm interested in. So I'll say label timeout and label units. Okay, so what's more, I'm just going to hit the Alt and Enter key, And Alt-Enter brings up the properties pane in Visual Studio. And the reason why I've done this is I thought I'd scroll down past a number of properties, and we can see a long list of ARIA properties that Visual Studio is aware of. So Visual Studio is now aware of ARIA. So I'll close that down. Now, I'll run that app. I'll launch Narrator again.
Narrator. Run. WinWeb. Back button.
Okay, so you can see the control that they added. It's an input field with the text labels timeout, one before and then seconds after. So I'm going to tab to, or first I'll tab to the ratings control.
Rating.
And now I'm going to tab to the new input field.
Timeout, seconds, editable text.
Okay, and so we heard Narrator say timeout seconds, and then went on to talk about the control type for the input field. So timeout seconds is the accessible name for this input field, because we used the ARIA label by markup to do that. Like I say, we didn't have to do that, but it was felt, I felt that that would be more helpful to the screen reader user than just saying timeout. Okay, I'll close Narrator down.
Exit Narrator.
Now, one other thing I'd like to do with this app is, I said earlier that the high contrast use is very important in the range of accessibility scenarios. So let's go to the personalization control panel and actually select a high contrast theme. Okay, and I'm going to pick the high contrast 1 theme. Okay, and I'm going to switch back to the app. Okay, now the app looks quite different. All the text that's displayed in the app is now shown in the foreground color of the high contrast theme I selected. Now, I didn't have to do anything to make that happen, it just happened by default. And what's more, the two controls that I just added, the rating control and the input field and its labels, are all now drawn in this same foreground color as all the text is drawn. And something else on the screen has changed that's very important, is that there were a number of areas before that were various shades of gray. They're no longer shown. And the reason for that is that they are described in the CSS for this app as background information, background colors. And for a high contrast theme user, to have background information presented in the app can sometimes be quite a distraction. The user wants crystal clear contrast between the foreground, often text, and the background. If there's additional background information presented behind the text, then that can hurt the user experience. So by default, this sort of background information, whether it's colors or images, won't be shown. But you can override that. If you know that the background information you're showing is going to be great for the user in these high contrast themes, then you can control that, and I'll give you a demo of how to do that shortly. So I'll switch back to the theme we had before. I'll close the app down. Okay, so you create a new app and it's accessible by default because the templates are accessible. Now you're going to add more things and turn it into your app. We've seen how if you use one of the controls that come with the Windows 8 SDK, they're going to be accessible by default. There could be some cases that you still do need to add some additional markup to make it fully accessible, and that's going to be normally an accessible name. And the example I've just given of adding a label, that doesn't have an accessible name by itself, so you would want to provide some way for a name to be provided. But you could choose that, you could decide that your UI is going to be built using some custom markup, not from one of the controls that comes with the SDK. And there's a good chance that if you build custom UI, it won't be accessible by default, and there'll be a number of steps you would do to actually make it fully accessible. And again, when you're doing this, the three of the very important accessibility-related scenarios that you'd be interested in would be the screen reader use, make sure it's fully keyboard accessible, and also the visual experience, particularly the use of high contrast themes and making things bigger on the screen. So what we'll do now is go back to Visual Studio, and we'll take a look at an app that actually already leverages some ARIA markup for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to close this new app that we created down. And I'm going to open up one of the apps that comes with the SDK, or rather, one of the samples that comes with the SDK. And it's called ARIA sample. I'll make the text bigger here. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll just do a quick search for the term ARIA. And we can see that in the HTML, there are a number of hits of ARIA with some explanatory text about how the ARIA is being used in this particular sample app. And the sample app doesn't actually do very much. It just illustrates some of the ways that you could use ARIA. So let's run the app. Okay. So I'm going to start Narrator again with the Windows Enter key.
Narrator window. Running programs. Disabled. ARIA sample. Group 2. Group 1.
Okay, so I'm tabbed to the list on the left and arrowed back and forth a bit. And so this app is keyboard accessible.
Group 2. Group 1.
And it can provide information. Now this list is pulled in from the Windows 8 SDK. I didn't have to do anything to make this list accessible. So there are two areas on the right of the screen, and I'll tab to those now.
Chat text area, log.
Chat text area, log, and I'll tab to the one towards the bottom right.
Chat input area, editable text.
Chat input area, editable text. Now, there's nothing on the screen that says chat input area, but somehow Narrator was managed to get the text chat input area. So let's take a look at how that was done.
Exit Narrator.
Close Narrator down and close the app down. So I'll scroll down to the end of this page, and we'll see an input tag at the end, and we'll see the text ARIA label chat input area. We saw earlier how ARIA label by was used to give an accessible name to a control where the text was actually gathered from some other piece of UI. In this case, I want to explicitly say this is the name of this control. So ARIA label can be great for making a fundamentally inaccessible piece of UI accessible. I think you'll be using that a lot in the future. And for your custom UI. And I've got here hard-coded English string of chat input area. Of course, when you built a great worldwide app, you'll be wanting to use localizable text in the markup here. And there's a great session that you want to go to learn about how to make your app worldwide ready. So let me delete that. Okay, I'll run the app again. I'm going to run Narrator again.
ARIA sample.
Now I'm going to tab to that input field again.
Editable text.
And it says editable text. Well, it is editable text, but I don't know what field that is. So in your app, when you have a number of input fields, if the user can't tell what the input field is, then the app is useless. So with that little piece of markup, it makes all the difference between having an inaccessible app and one that can be great. Now, I'm going to switch back to the markup again. And we're going to take a look at the area above that input field, that simulated chat history window. That's the one that can be dynamically updated. And as I said earlier, this is very important for screen reader users to know when there's been some update in the app's UI, which is in an area that they're not directly working with. They could be working with some other piece of UI, and then some really important piece of information shows up on the UI, and they must be made aware of that. And how you can make that happen is by marking that piece of UI as a live region. And by saying it's a live region, a screen reader can be notified of the update and make the user aware of it. So what I've done here is added the markup, ARIA live assertive. And what that means is this is a live region, and the user should be notified when there are updates to this piece of UI. Now, what's more, I've given it a value of assertive, which means that this piece of UI is so important that if there are updates, then the user should be notified immediately, even interrupting what they're currently doing elsewhere in the app. Now, I put that there just for explanatory purposes with a comment about that, because you would actually use, in practice, you would use assertive with care. because if a piece of UI constantly is updated and constantly interrupts the user, then this could actually be quite an irritation, could even block them from using some other piece of UI. So you would only use assertive with care. And in fact, for an app like this, what you might consider doing instead is using another value of polite, which means that, yes, the user should be made aware of this update, but they shouldn't be interrupted from what they're doing at the time. The screen reader should wait until the user's not doing something and then make them aware of this change that happened. And in fact, if I did want to make this piece of UI a live region but polite, then what I could have done is simply use the role of log. Because I mentioned earlier that ARIA allows you to specify roles, basically giving meaning to the UI. And by giving a role of log, then a screen reader can infer from that it is actually a polite live region. And so if I just wanted a polite live region for this, I wouldn't have needed to use the ARIA live markup at all and just use the role of log. And another thing I'd mention about the ARIA is, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it both on the screen. Yes, there we go. ARIA has the concept of landmarks, which you can specify certain areas to be landmarks, which can help the user navigate between sections on your app with a screen reader, and can also help a screen reader provide kind of more context about what the meaning of a particular area is. And here we see a role of banner, and further below, a role of main. They're both examples of landmarks. And again, on the web, there's lots of information about the different types of landmarks available to you. So what I want to do next is just show a couple of interesting things relating to keyboard accessibility in this sample app. We saw a moment ago how I could tab between these the different areas. I went from the list, went from the big chat history window to the input area. And by default, because that was such a custom piece of UI as I made, this big chat history area, that isn't keyboard accessible by default. So if the user needs to be able to interact with that, a keyboard user couldn't do that. So it's very important for me to say, this must be able to get keyboard focus. And so how this is done, and again I'll scroll down to the end of the page, is this is the markup for that chat hit history area. And there's a piece of markup there, tab index. And that is really important. I can't overstress the importance of tab index as far as making your app accessible. Because tab index means that when the user presses the tab key to move focus through a sequence of interactable controls in your UI, then this piece of UI will be included in that sequence. And by giving it a value of 0 here, it's saying, I want the order in which the keyboard focus will reach this piece of UI to be the same as the order in which this element appears in the DOM, which is, in this case, just above the input field. So tab index is really important. Another markup that I'll show here, which relates to keyboard accessibility, is access key. And what this means is this is being applied to the input field at the bottom right of the app. And by doing this, I'm saying that if a user presses the Alt key and the I key, just take keyboard focus straight to this field. So if you have a lot of interactable UI on your app, rather than the user having to press tab potentially a great many times to get to the piece of UI they want to get to, you could consider adding an access key just to make it quick and easy for them to get there really quickly. Now, what I'd also like to do here is show a screenshot of this app, this sample app, with the Windows 8 on-screen keyboard beneath it. In Windows 8, if the screen resolution is sufficient, then the user can choose to have the on-screen keyboard docked beneath your app. And the on-screen keyboard is an accessibility feature. It has a click mode, but it also has a hover mode and a scan mode too. And so by making your app fully keyboard accessible, then a user who can only move their head or can only move their feet can leverage the full functionality of your app. And that is a powerful thing. So the next thing I'm going to show relates to high contrast again. And I'm going to show how to customize that default behavior we saw earlier, where some background information was not shown. So I'll run the app. And I'm going to navigate to a second page in the app. And at the top, towards the top left of the screen, is a colorful image. Now, I'm going to go back to the personalization control panel and pick a high contrast theme. I'll pick the same one as we saw earlier. I'll switch back to the app. Okay. That image, the colorful image we saw earlier, isn't shown anymore. Instead, there's a different image that's more appropriate for this theme. And in this case, it's the one with a light foreground and a dark background. So now I'm going to switch back to the personalization CPL again, and I'll pick a different high contrast theme that has dark on light. I'll switch back to the app. Okay, the image has changed again. It's now appropriate for this theme. It's got a dark foreground and a light background. So I'll switch back to the regular theme, and we'll take a look at the way in which that happened. Okay, and how this is done is using media queries in the CSS for this app. So I'll open up the CSS for the app. I'll make it larger. We'll scroll down to the end. Okay, and this is how we got those different images to be presented in the different themes. There's a media query that says, if the screen is in high contrast, then for this particular piece of UI, don't take the default action of not showing the background information for this piece of UI. Instead, set the background to be this particular image. And it's one that I built that was more appropriate for a light on dark background. And what's more, we can take that further to say, again, if the screen is in high contrast, but it's in a particular high contrast theme of black on white, then use yet another image for the background of this element. And this is one that I created that's more appropriate for dark on light. So I didn't have to write any JavaScript to react to theme change notifications and then select an appropriate image. All I did was set these media queries up in the CSS. And what's more, there's a way to do it with even fewer lines. And that when you specify the background information, the background image for this element, you can actually list a number of files. And by using a particular naming convention, you can say, I want this to be the one that's shown in high contrast dark on light, and this one to be the high contrast light on dark. And so, in fact, it's now a piece of cake to really fine-tune the images that are shown with these different high contrast themes. Okay, so you're feeling pretty good about the accessibility of your app. You've built it from one of the accessible templates, and you've added some markup. Now you really want to verify it, so you can try and identify any places that might be a problem, that might not be as accessible as you thought. And there's a couple of great tools that come with the SDK to help in doing that. One's called Inspect, and one's called Act Checker. So I'm going to do a couple of demos of those now. Okay, so we'll run the app again. And now I'm going to launch Inspect. And it's part of the Windows 8 SDK. You have it. I'll switch back to the app. Okay. Right, and I'm going to launch the magnifier because it's a bit difficult to see this. Windows Plus. Okay. And what Inspect can show is that up at the top here, there's the text back for the name of the control. It says it's a button control type, and it's giving me the bounding recs of the piece of UI on the screen, and it gives a ton of information about this element. Now, Inspect uses UI automation to gather up all the information. So any assistive technology client, such as a screen reader that uses UI automation, can get all this information. So you can be sure that if the accessible name for this UI is a helpful name, then any screen reader can get that. If, however, the name were blank, then this is something you might want to think, that doesn't look quite right, I should look into adding an accessible name for that. And what's more, towards the left-hand side of what Inspect shows is a hierarchical tree that's used by UI automation to understand how this element relates to other elements in your UI. So it shows the back button there, and beneath it, it shows that text area that we saw earlier, that's the title, as a sibling to that element. And they're both contained within that banner. And we saw the role of banner being applied earlier as a landmark. So both those elements are contained within that. So a screen reader can help the user navigate around this tree of elements. And while we're in Inspect, I would also like to, I'll hover over that big chat history window, that simulated chat history window earlier, and Inspect will repopulate itself with all the accessible information about that window. And the reason why I wanted to do that is just to show the ARIA role of log, and also the ARIA properties, and there's a list of those. It's the label, chat text area, it's live, we saw that, live assertive, multi-line, and a few other things. So this is emphasizing the point that any ARIA markup, any of the role or properties information you add to your app is easily accessible through UI automation to any screen reader or other assistive technology app that uses UI automation. So I'll close Magnifier down, and I'll close Inspect down. Okay, so the other tool I wanted to show was Act Checker. I'll run that. I'll switch back to the app. Okay, Act Checker can run runtime verifications on your UI. So bring it up while your app's running, and point it to your UI, and it can run a long list of verifications. Now, we're only going to look at 2 today. And these are all part of the ARIA-related verifications that come with Act Checker. We're going to ask Act Checker to take a look at the UI and look for anything that doesn't seem quite right with the role information or the properties information. So the app is already selected up here. So now I'm going to say Run Verifications. And what you'd want to do if you have multiple pages in your app, you'd want to run Act Checker against the different views of your app, and so it has a chance to examine all of the parts of your UI. Okay, now I'll run Magnifier again. Act Checker says it looks like there could be an error in the UI. There might be a problem with its accessibility. And what it's saying is an element is of type input or a number of other things, but it doesn't have an accessible name. Okay, so it thinks that something doesn't have an accessible name. And what's more, using the bounding rect information that was available to Act Checker, it's tried to highlight which part of the UI seems to be the problem. And what it's saying is the input field doesn't look as though it's accessible. It looks like it's missing an accessible name. So let's take a look at the markup we have and see what the problem might be. So I'll minimize Act Checker. Close the app down. We'll take a look at the markup. Okay, so it says this input field has no accessible name. And that's right, it doesn't. I took it out earlier, and basically in doing so, I broke the accessibility of the app. So let me undo that change. Stick the ARIA label back in. I'll run the app again. I'll run Act Checker again. And see what it thinks of it this time. Again, we're still just running the 2 verifications. Okay, and this time, Act Checker couldn't find an error. So Act Checker can be great to draw your attention to places that might have problems. Now, just because ActChecker says it can't find anything doesn't mean that your app is completely accessible, but it's part of the suite of things you can do to help feel confident about its accessibility. And in fact, there are a number of other things you can do that are really useful and can be pretty quick to do that don't rely on the use of SDK tools at all. They're just manual tests you can do. And to give an example of these, just try using your app only with the keyboard. Don't touch the screen, don't use the mouse. And can you do everything that your app provides just using the keyboard? On a personal note, a couple of years ago at work, I unplugged my mouse for 10 months and did my day job just with the keyboard. And that was really quite educational. After a while, using most apps, it was actually fine once I got to know the keyboard shortcuts. And in fact, there were times when it was actually more efficient for me to use just a keyboard. But there were some apps that weren't particularly easy to use with the keyboard. And once in a while, I'd find a web page that was inaccessible, and I couldn't do what I wanted. Excuse me. So try using your app just with the keyboard. Another thing you can do is try using it in a high contrast theme. What does it look like? It looked great with a regular theme. Does it still look great in high contrast? A classic problem can be there's some text that's hard-coded to be black. And when you switch to a high contrast theme that has light on dark, the text is shown as black on black. It's completely invisible. And basically that can completely break your app. Some users just won't be able to use it. And so those are two things that can sometimes just take minutes to do and can be really valuable in feeling confident about the accessibility of your app. And if you want to, you could take it further and try using your app with Narrator. Don't look at the screen or turn the screen off. Just tab around your UI with Narrator. Do you actually get to a control where Narrator can't describe what it is? Maybe that's something you'd want to look at further. Okay. Okay, so you've created a new app, you've developed it, you've verified it, and you're feeling pretty good about it. Now you really want to draw attention to the fact that it is accessible. So how you can do that, when it comes to publishing your app at the Windows Store, you can declare that it meets a certain base level of accessibility. And there's more information about what a base level of accessibility is on the Windows developer sites. But basically, it pretty much relates to the sort of thing we've been talking about today. It's great with a screen reader. It's fully keyboard accessible. It can be used with the user's visual settings. Now, when people are trying to learn about what accessible apps are available, potential customers can filter on apps that declare themselves to be accessible. So whereas in the past it could be really difficult to learn what accessible apps are out there, now it's a piece of cake. It's a piece of cake for customers to find these accessible apps. And for some users, it will be because they absolutely need the accessible features. Some cases, it'll be because they find apps easier to use by leveraging some accessible features. And in some cases, it'll be because some potential customers feel that developers who build accessible apps are committed to quality. And that's the sort of thing on the screen now that you would see when it comes to publishing your app at the store and saying it meets these accessibility requirements. And that's the sort of thing that your potential customers will be seeing when they start filtering on accessible apps and making it really easy for them to discover your app. The accessibility community is known to be very supportive of apps, of developers that build accessible apps. And by building accessible apps, your customers will be showing their appreciation by giving your app high ratings, which will raise the visibility of your app on the store. And what's more, the Windows Store is a great way to channel feedback from your customers back to you to help you consider whether any adjustments or enhancements you'd like to make to the accessibility features of your app. So, we've seen that it's industry standard technologies that are used to make your app accessible. We've built in support for accessibility into the app development platform from start to finish, from creating a new app, developing it, verifying it, and ultimately selling it. So build great accessible apps and open them up to the very large number of potential customers who are looking for that all-round power of accessible apps. There are some related sessions on here, including one about building worldwide ready apps, so you avoid having hard coding in English strings or another language in your app. Also, some further reading, great reading on building Metro-style apps in HTML5 in general, and also an interesting document on how the accessible parts of HTML5 and ARIA map to what a UI automation client such as a screen reader would see. So I'm going to head over now to the expo hall, the apps booth, and I'll look forward to meeting you and talking more about building accessible Metro-style apps. Thank you.